What happens when a Muslim meets a Viking? Sounds like the beginning of a bad joke, but did actually happen. My name is Matt, and normally I'm all about world building and stuff, but today I got a true story for you taken straight from a historical document. I found it very inspiring and helpful for our world building endeavors since it contains a lot of interesting details about different cultures. I'm talking about the journey of Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab ambassador who traveled north to meet the king of the Volga Bulgars, so basically Vikings. Fadlan wrote about the hardships of his journey as well as the different cultures he encountered in his Risala. Today we would probably call it a travel blog, I guess. So again, this is a true story taken straight from the year 922. Very exciting. But before we get into it, I need to give you a short disclaimer. This whole story should be taken with a grain of salt, or a whole tablespoon of salt probably. Take it as an inspiration for your world building, don't take it as concrete evidence. This is a 40-year-old translation of an old Arabic text, and we shouldn't take it word for word. Instead, we need to look at the bigger picture. This already confusing premise adds nicely to the fact that Fadlan's writings are quite jumbled up as they are. He goes back and forth between journeying and the cultural oddities he encounters. I'm gonna break it down into multiple parts. Today we're gonna talk about his journey and the dangers he had to face. The second part will probably be about the Turks and other cultures he encounters along the way, and the last video will be on the account of the Volga Bulgars and the Rus people, and in particular, one very cruel burial ritual. I'm only gonna read the interesting parts and summarize the rest, but if you want to hear the full account of Ibn Fadlan and see me struggle with Arabic names and places for the first 10 minutes, there's a link in the description. Although, I recommend you watch this video first so you have a better understanding of what's going on. So, here we go. Oh, and another disclaimer, most of the pictures I'm showing are just to show any pictures at all because there are no pictures from that time, okay? Nothing historical here, just flavor. Alright, let's go. The story begins in the year 921 with Almish, Ilteber, basically king, of the Volga Bulgars. In his writings, Fadlan refers to Almish as the king of the Sakaliba, the king of slaves. This is due to the fact that Slavs were often sold as slaves, which, by the way, is where the word slave comes from. Think of that what you will. My interpretation is that Sakaliba had just come to be the term used for Slavic people in general at the time, and it's not meant in a diminutive way by Fadlan. But at the same time, I can imagine that people from the Caliphate would look down on these people at least a little bit. Anyway, back to Almish. So King Almish wants to convert to Islam and asks the Caliph of Baghdad, Al-Muqtadir, to give him religious guidance. And oh, by the way, could you spare some money for me to build a fortress to defend my territory against the Khazars? You know, in return for converting? It went something like that. The exact political circumstances shall not be topic of this video, and I think they're not quite clear, but don't quote me on that. All you need to know for now is that Al-Muqtadir agrees to this, and sends out his ambassador, Susan al-Rasi, whom I shall refer to as Susan from here on. Following Susan is a huge caravan of several thousand mounts, carrying various goods and riches.
It's over 9,000!
No, it's not, but at least at one point of the journey, Fadlan mentions on a side note that there were over 3,000 mounts. Among Susan's staff is our man Ibn Fadlan, who is his secretary, and a religious counselor who's supposed to teach the Bulgars Islamic law and show them the Muslim way of life. So while we're basically reading Fadlan's travel diary, it's important to keep in mind that we are seeing all these foreign cultures through the lens of a relatively wealthy and strictly religious Muslim man, who likes to complain a lot and sometimes seems to be a little sissy for his time. On 21st of June, Susan and the boys set out from Baghdad toward Bukhara, a well-known and much-traveled route, so not a lot happens. They go from city to city, often staying a day or sometimes more than that. So this is one of those things that's very important for our world building. If there is trade, there will be some established routes that are most favorable. Maybe only sometimes of the year, maybe always. The cities along these routes would be well accustomed to travelers, and most likely they'd be rich. I mean, imagine the biggest city back then. They had 1,000, maybe a couple thousand residents at best, and then suddenly a caravan of 3,000 mounts comes through, with probably the same amount of people. And they are all looking for shelter, maybe food and drink, maybe they even ran out of provisions and they need to stock up. All that generates a lot of money and promotes a certain way of life for the residents in these cities. I can't talk about it in much more detail or else the video will become very long, but I will some other time. I also just made a video about cities and how they grow, so go check out the link in the end card if you're interested. Back to the caravan. So they often stop in a city. In Kushmahan they even stay for 3 days in order to rest the camels before going through the desert. In a more recent translation they even change camels. Remember, 3,000 camels. After arriving in Bukhara, Susan and the gang were supposed to meet up with one Ahmad ibn Musa, who, if I understand correctly, was gonna bring the money for Almish, separately from the caravan, because mind games, I guess. However, Ibn Musa didn't show up, because somehow some devious Christian, who confusingly also goes by the name Ibn Musa, plotted against them. So bad guy Ibn Musa had good guy Ibn Musa arrested in Merv. The Fadlaravan waited for him in Bukhara for 28 days. I'm assuming this was not planned. Then someone warned them that
Winter is coming.
and that they needed to go now if they wanted to travel north. So they just left without the money, because F Almish, but we're gonna convert them anyway. Honestly, I don't know what they were expecting, but needless to say, this caused some trouble when they got there. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyway, so they lost a lot of time in Bukhara and decided to actually go backwards a little to the river Jaihun, now known as Amudarya, and hire a boat to travel north to Khorasmia. I'm not sure if that was the route they were originally going for, but I assume not. So these things can happen. They called upon the Amir of the region, whose name I'm gonna spare you with, who granted them residence, but almost denied them entry into the land of the Turks as, quote, "There are 1,000 tribes of unbelievers." Somehow they managed to change his mind in the end, which is only explained as dealing gently with him and flattering him. I guess Fadlan just rolled high on a persuasion check. So they make it to Georgiania, now called Old Urgench, which is still in Khorasmia. When winter hits so hard, they have to stop and stay for several months. Again, think about how much money 3,000 people would spend there if they stayed that long. Also, whenever I'm saying money, I actually mean not only silver dirhams, but also various goods and valuables. So yeah, they can't go on because of how cold it is here. Fadlan tells us how the river Jaihun froze over 70 spans in thickness. A span is a unit of measurement from the tip of the little finger to the tip of the thumb. So like, what, 15 to 20 centimeters? So the ice must have been 3 meters thick. Although other sources state that it only ever froze over 5 spans in thickness. Anyhow, there was enough so, quote, horses, mules, donkeys, and carts passed over it the same way they pass over roads. Fadlan has more to say about the winter in Georgiania, and it's actually all quite interesting, so I'd just like to read it to you. Our stay in Georgiania was prolonged in that we stayed there a number of days of Rajab and of the month of Shaban, Ramadan, and Shawwal. The length of our stay was due to the severity of the cold. I have been informed that 2 men drove out 12 camels, on which they intended to carry firewood from one of the thickets, and that they forgot to take any flint and tinder with them, and passed the night without a fire. Next morning, the 2 men and camels were dead because of the severity of the cold. I have seen that, because of the dreadfulness of its cold, its markets and streets would be so completely empty that a man might roam through the greater part of the streets and markets without finding anyone, and without having been met by anyone. When I used to come out of the public bath and enter my house, I would look at my beard and find it to have been frozen into a solid piece of ice, which made me bring it closer to the fire. I used to sleep in a house, within which was a tent of Turkish felt, covered up with garments and furs, and still my cheek would sometimes get stuck to the pillow. I saw large water storage jars there, clothed in large covers made of sheepskin so that they would not become cracked or broken, but it availed to them not in the least. I saw the earth crack open, resulting in great ravines, by reason of the intense cold. As a matter of fact, a huge ancient tree was wont to split in half, on account of the cold. But sure enough, winter passes, it's now February, and they get ready to move on. Some people of the caravan stayed in Georgiania or left, fearing that the lands they were about to traverse will be, quote, an infernally cold portal to the depths of hell. But of course, this can't stop Susan and the gang, and Fadlan writes, the season began to change. The river Jaihun thawed, and we set about preparing what we might need of travel equipment. We provisioned ourselves with bread, millet, and jerked meat enough for 3 months. We purchased Turkish camels and had collapsible camel skin boats I have never heard of collapsible boats before. It literally sounds like a fantasy thing, and I love it. Also, for some reason, it's only now that Fadlan gets the idea of, man, this letter says there will be 4,000 dinars cash, and we didn't bring the money. Maybe the king will be mad. Spoiler, he will be mad. But Fadlan's companions are like, nah, it'll be fine. So they move on. And the way in which they move on is also quite funny, so I'm gonna read that again. Those of the people of the town with whom we were on friendly terms advised us to take adequate precautions, to be provided with suitable clothes, and to make certain to procure large quantities of them. They exaggerated the grimness of the undertaking and magnified the dangers of the affairs. When we experienced it, it was many times worse than what had been described to us. Every one of us had a tunic, on top of which was a kaftan, on top of which was a sheepskin overcoat, on top of which was a felt overcoat, and a hooded cloak from which nothing could be seen but one's eyes. We also wore a pair of unlined baggy trousers, as well as a second pair of lined trousers, legging, and boots made of shagreen. On top of the boots, there was another pair of boots. Each one of us, when mounted on his camel, was unable to move on account of the clothes that were on him. By the way, stacking shoes was possible because you would wear so-called turnover shoes. Those were mostly leather shoes that would be sewn together inside out and then turned, hence the name. And they're a lot less stable and don't have a real sole. So they're more like leather socks and there's no real problem stacking them. Alright, back to our story. It's now the 4th of March and the Fadlaravan arrives at the fortified outpost called Zamjan, where they spent the night. The next day, snow fell so heavily on us that the camels waded up to their knees through it. Thus, we remained at this way station for 2 days. We then moved on, penetrating deeply into the land of the Turks, not paying attention to anything, and not being met by anybody in an uninhabited, mountainless steppe. We journeyed through it for 10 days and experienced adversity, exertion, extreme cold, and uninterrupted snowstorms, in comparison with which the cold of Khwarizm seemed like the days of summer. We forgot all that we had experienced before and were on the point of perishing. One day we were afflicted with an especially severe cold. Tekin was walking by my side, and next to him was a Turk who was speaking to him in Turkish. Tekin laughed and said, "What is it that our Lord wants from us? Here he is killing us with cold, and if we knew what he wanted, we would certainly give it to him." And I said to him, "Tell him he wants you to say, La aliha illa Allah, there is no God but God." He laughed and said, "If we knew how, we would do it," to which I can absolutely relate. We then arrived after that at a place in which there was an enormous quantity of wood. We halted there, and members of the caravan lit a fire, warmed themselves, took off their clothes, and spread them out to dry. Then we set out, and we continued to travel without interruption every night from midnight until the afternoon or until noon of the following day, traveling in the most strenuous manner and covering the greatest possible distance, after which we would stop. They ride on as fast as possible. They travel almost non-stop for 15 days, almost freezing to death, and, if I understand correctly, suffering some degree of frostbite. Finally, they arrive at a tribe of Guzia Turks, which I'll talk about some more next time. But if I understand correctly, these guys are kind of a rent-a-camel for Muslims. They spend a good while with those Turks as they were escorting them. So it might well be that there weren't as many mounts before and now there are 3,000 mounts. Fadlan also tells us about meeting Yinal the Little, a king of the Turks who once converted to Islam and when his people didn't like it and rebelled against him, abjured Islam again. Now he wouldn't let them pass at first, so they had to bribe him, and he wasn't the only ruler who was presented with gifts in order to be allowed to move on. Some of them even said like, "These guys are probably Soviet spies, let's cut them in half." Okay, maybe it was more like these guys are sent by the Caliphate to meet the Khazars and raise an army against us, but same concept. And they did want to cut them in half. Or exchange them for some of their men the Khazars were holding captive at the time, which, given that they weren't actually spies, probably would have gone horribly wrong. So they were held captive there and almost died, possibly almost starving to death, it's not explained any further. But again, they managed to bribe them and were allowed passage. There was yet another man who had to be bribed for passage, and this is one of my favorite stories as well. So I'm gonna read this one again. The next day we encountered a lone Turk of ugly countenance, shabby appearance, mean looks, and despicable demeanor, just as we were overtaken by a heavy rain. He said, "Halt," and the entire caravan, comprising close to 3,000 mounts and 5,000 men, came to a halt. Then he said, "Not one of you will pass," and we halted in obedience of his order. We said to him, "We are friends of the Korakin," whereupon he began to laugh and say, "Who is the Korakin? I shit on the beard of Korakin." Then he said pakand, which means bread in the language of Khwarizm, and I handed him some round, flat loaves of bread. He took them and said, "Pass, I have taken pity upon you." After all the bribery and charity, the caravan moves on and has to cross the river Yagandi, or Bagandi. And this one is a really interesting read, and it sounds like something straight from a movie. We traveled until we arrived at the river Yagandi. The men brought out their collapsible boats, which are made of camel hides, and spread them out. They took down the furnishing from the Turkish camels, because they are circular, and placed them inside the collapsible boats, so that they were stretched. Then they filled them with clothing, baggage, and when they were filled, a group of 5, 6, or 4 men, more or less, sat in each boat. They took in their hands kadank wood, using it as oars. They continued to row, and the water carried the boats along as they turned round and round until they went across. As for the mounts and camels, they called out to them, and they crossed by swimming. It was essential that a troop of soldiers cross over with their weapons before any part of the caravan went across. This was in order that they would serve as an advance guard for the members of the caravan, lest the Bashkirs, it was feared, fall suddenly on them crossing the river. And they have to repeat this process for the rivers Jam, Jakash, Adil, Ardin, Warish, Akati, and Wabna, which Fadlan all describes as big white rivers. And by the way, all of these names might have changed to completely different names over time, or maybe I pronounced them wrong because the Arabic writing system doesn't always spell out vowels, which to us seems kind of weird, but apparently it works. Anyway, so the caravan reaches the Pechenek people. They had settled down near a great lake, quote, resembling a sea. There they stay for 1 day and move on to cross more rivers, and this I'd like to read to you again. We then moved on and camped on the river Jaik. It was the largest river we had seen, the most imposing, and the one with the strongest current. Indeed, I saw a collapsible boat overturn, and all those aboard drown. Several men from the caravan perished, and a number of camels and mounts drowned. We crossed it only with great difficulty. So yeah, these boats are not only hard to steer, they are also a little dangerous. And in a newer translation, that line actually reads, "A great many drowned." So after this tragedy, our caravan of now not quite 3,000 mounts has to cross more rivers, namely Jaka, Askan, Baja. I can't. It's SMWR. It's Samawar? I don't know. And the rivers Canal, Su, Kichlu. I'm already sick of these names, and there's more to come. So then they reach the Bashkirs, whom Fadlan describes as the most wicked of them all. So I guess they didn't stay for long. River crossing time again. Jaramsan, Bainaj, Wati, Banasna, and Joshin. In total, they crossed 23 rivers by collapsible camel skin boat. And between each of those rivers there was a journey of a couple days. Finally, on May 12th of 922, they arrive at their destination. So they've been traveling for almost 9 months. They have now reached the land of the Bulgars, where they are first greeted and escorted by 4 kings under Almish and a couple of his relatives, meaning his sons and whatnot. When they finally meet him in person, according to Fadlan, he prostrates himself, meaning he throws himself down on the floor, giving thanks to God. He then showered them with money, which he had in his sleeve. This sounds a little extravagant, and in a newer translation, this money shower is actually left out, but in both versions, he did carry money for his guests in his sleeve. They then pitched tents for their guests, and on the matter of these tents, I'm actually completely in the dark. And this is something I'd be really interested in, because how this nation is living is one of your main concerns as a world builder. What are their houses like? How do they accommodate for their guests? And stuff like that. But yeah, I have no idea what their tents looked like. I did find another version that is talking of yurts, which are Turkish tents. But given that we are talking about Viking-esque cultures, it would make sense if their first idea of how to build a tent would be build it like a house. So what comes to my mind is a triangle shape. But like I said, I'm completely in the dark with this. I have no idea what their tents looked like. So if you know any more than I do, please put it in the comments. And if you don't, what do you think? Would they build triangular tents like the houses of the Norse people coming down the Volga River? Or would they put up circular tents like Turkish yurts? Anyway, back to our story. So they are hanging out in their tents for a couple days, and after that they're having a ceremony to convert Almish to Islam. And after that they have possibly the weirdest banquet ever, and I'd like to read you all of these things. When it was Thursday and they had assembled, we unfurled the 2 standards which were with us, saddled the horse with the saddle that had been sent to him, clothed the king in black, and made him don a turban. I brought out the Caliph's letter and said to him, "It is not permitted for us to remain seated while the Caliph's letter is being read." He rose to his feet, as did all of those who were present from among the notables of his kingdom. He is a very stout and paunchy man. The interpreter continued to translate for us the text of the letter word for word. When we had finished reading it, they shouted the magnification of God in such a manner that the earth trembled. I then read the letter of the wazir, Hamid ibn al-Abbas, while he remained standing. When I had finished reading it, his companions showered a large amount of money on him. I then took out the gifts of perfume, clothing, and pearls intended for him and for his wife. I then, in the presence of the people, bestowed upon his wife a robe of honor as she sat by his side, this being their custom and usage. When I had bestowed upon her the robe of honor, money was showered upon her by the women, and we departed. After an hour had elapsed, he sent for us, and we went before him, as he sat in his tent with the kings sitting at his right side. He then bid us to be seated on his left side. We found his sons sitting in front of him, while he was sitting alone upon the throne covered with Greek brocade. He called for a table, and it was brought, and on it was a roast meat only. He himself began, took a knife, cut a bite-sized morsel, and ate it. Then a second, a third. Then he cut off a piece and gave it to Sawsan the ambassador. As the latter took it, a small table was brought and placed in front of him. Such is the custom. No one extends his hand to the food until the king gives him a bite, and as soon as he takes it, the table is brought before him. Then he offered me a bite, and a table was brought to me. He then cut a piece and offered it to the king, who was on his right side, and a table was brought to him. He then served a second king, a table was brought to him. He then served a fourth king, a table was brought to him. He then served his sons, and tables were brought to them. We ate, each one from his own table, no one sharing it with him, and no one taking anything from a table other than his own. When the meal was over, each one of them carried to his house whatever was left on his table. When we had eaten, he called for a beverage made from honey, which they call suju, which takes a day and a night to prepare. He drank a cup, then rose to his feet, and said, "This is an expression of my pleasure with my master, the commander of the faithful. May God prolong his life." The 4 kings and his sons stood up when he stood up, as did we. He did that repeatedly until he had done it 3 times. We then departed from his presence. After this, if I understand correctly, Fadlan travels the lands with Almish. This will be topic for the next videos, but we got one thing left, the money problem. Because at some point, Almish is like, weren't they supposed to bring me some money? It almost seems to me like he forgot about this for a couple days or didn't even bother, which is understandable because he's actually rich. He doesn't even need the money. He just tried to turn a profit out of this whole conversion thing. He could have easily built the fortress himself. And when Fadlan asks him about this way later, he actually flat out admits it. Get this. I asked him one day, saying to him, "Your kingdom is extensive, your wealth is abundant, and your tax revenues are many. Why did you ask the Caliph to build a fortress with an amount of money from his coffers that is of no account?" He said, "I found the empire of Islam to be prosperous, and recourse may be had to its lawfully derived revenues. I sought these funds for this reason. Had I wanted to build a fortress of silver and gold with my own money, the attainment of such an objective would not have been difficult for me. I merely sought to benefit from the blessing that attaches to the money of the commander of the faithful, and for which reason I asked him for it." But like I said, this was way later, so for now, despite the fact that this money isn't actually an issue, he gets quite upset. So to conclude Fadlan's journey, I want to read this passage to you. When 3 days had passed after the reading of the letter and the delivery of the gifts, he sent for me, having come to know of the 4,000 dinars and how the ruse of the Christian had resulted in delaying the payment thereof. Information concerning this matter was contained in a letter. When I entered his presence, he bade me to be seated, and I sat down. He threw the letter of the commander of the faithful to me and said, "Who brought this letter?" I replied, "I did." He then threw the letter of the wazir and said, "And this one too?" I replied, "I did." He then said, "And the money that has been mentioned in both of them, what has been done with it?" I said, "It was impossible to collect it. Time was short, and we feared lest we fail to gain entry into the land of the Turks on time. We left the money behind to catch up with us later." He said, "You came, the whole lot of you, and my master spent what he spent on you, only in order that this money be brought to me, so that I might build a fortress which would protect me from the Jews who enslaved me. As for the gifts, my Ghulam would have been able to bring them." I said, "It is as you say. However, we did our best." He told his interpreter, "Tell him I do not know these others. I only know you, for these are a non-Arab people. Had the Caliph, may God support him, thought that they were capable of doing what you could do, he would not have sent you to safeguard my interests, to read his letter to me, and to listen to my response. I will not demand a single dirham from anyone but you. Give up the money, it is better for you." I left his presence frightened and distressed. He was a man of striking appearance and dignity, stout and broad, who sounded as though he were speaking from inside a large barrel. I left him, gathered my colleagues, and acquainted them with what had passed between him and me. I said to them, "This is what I had been afraid of." His muaddin used to double the ikama when he performed the call to prayer. So I said to the king, "Your master, the commander of the faithful, recites the formulas of the ikama only once in his abode." He told the muaddin, "Accept what he tells you and do not contradict him." The muaddin kept this up for a few days as the king continued to question me about the money and to debate the matter with me, while I did not cease to argue and to make him despair of it. When he had lost all hope of getting it, he ordered the muaddin to double the formulas of the ikama once more, and he did. He intended by this to create an issue as a means for debating the matter with me. When I heard the muaddin doubling the formulas of the ikama, I forbade him to do so and shouted at him. The king heard of this and caused me and my companions to be brought into his presence. When we assembled, he said to the interpreter, "Tell him," meaning me, "what does he say concerning two muaddins, one of whom recites the formulas of the ikama once and the other recites them twice. Then each of them leads a group of people in the ritual prayer. Is the prayer valid or invalid?" I said, "The prayer is valid." He said, "In accordance with the differences of legal opinion or in accordance with consensus?" I said, "In accordance with consensus." "Tell him, what does he say about a man who entrusted certain men with his money intended for a group of weak, blockaded, and enslaved people, and you betrayed him?" I said, "This is not permitted, and these are evil people." He said, "According to differing legal opinions, or according to consensus?" I said, "According to consensus." He said to the interpreter, "Tell him, were the Caliph, may God prolong his life, to send an army against me, would it prevail over me?" I said, "No." He said, "And the Amir of the Khurasan?" I said, "No." He said, "Is that not because of the remoteness of the distance and the multitude of tribes of unbelievers which lie between us?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Tell him, I swear to God that although I happen to be in my distant abode wherein you see me, yet I am afraid of my master the commander of the faithful. That is because I am afraid that he might come to hear something about me that he might not like, and that, as a consequence, he might pray to God and cause me to perish in my own abode, while he is in his kingdom. And between him and me lie vast distances. Yet you, who eat his bread and wear his clothes, and see him all the times, have betrayed him with regard to his mission on which he sent you to me, to a weak people, and you have betrayed the Muslims. I will not accept guidance from you in a matter pertaining to my religion until there comes to me a man who cherishes my welfare in what he says. When a man of this type comes to me, I will be receptive to him." We were rendered speechless and were unable to answer him, and thus we departed from his presence. He said, after this statement, he began to favor me over others and to draw me close to his person, while keeping my companions at a distance.
You're my friend now.
And thus they kind of become friends, or at least acquaintances, and travel the lands together. I'm not actually sure whether or not Almish did in fact receive the money in the end, but I find it hilarious that he's just trying to turn a profit with this whole conversion thing, and not even a big one. Even though he's like, "Oh yeah, I could totally build that castle out of pure gold and silver," when he doesn't get his money, he gets upset He shouts, he causes a scene, he causes an issue with his muezzin reciting some formulas wrong. It's pure drama, it's better than any soap opera. And there's a lot more fun to be had, because I skipped over everything that Fadlan says about the Turks, the Bashkirs, the Pechenegs, the Volga Bulgars and the Rus. So this will all be subject of the next 2 videos, and if you're interested, click that subscribe button and hit the bell. And most important of all, share this video with everyone who might be interested, because A, it's a great resource, and B, that's the best help you can provide for me to grow my channel. I hope you had fun. I know I did. My name has been and will continue to be Matt Muffin, and I hope I'll see you for my next video. Thanks for watching, have a wonderful time, Muffin out.